There was a man in Lystra who couldn't walk. He sat there crippled since the day of his birth. And he heard Paul talking, and Paul, looking him in the eyes, saw that he was ripe for God's work and ready to believe. So he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Up! Up on your feet!" The man was up in a flash, jumped up, walked around as if he'd been walking all his life. And when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they went wild, calling out in their Lycaonian dialect, "The gods have come down! These men are gods!" They called Barnabas Zeus and Paul Hermes, since Paul did most of the speaking. And the priest of the local Zeus shrine got up a parade, bulls and banners, and people lined right up to the gates, ready for the ritual of sacrifice. And when Barnabas and Paul finally realized what was going on, they stopped them. Waving their arms, they interrupted the parade, calling out, "What do you think you're doing? We're not gods. We're men just like you. And we're here to bring you the message to persuade you to abandon these silly God superstitions and embrace God himself, the living God. We don't make God. He makes us. And all of this, sky and earth and sea and everything in them. In the generations before us, God let all the different nations go their own way, but even then he didn't leave them without a clue, for he made a good creation, poured down rain, and gave bumper crops. When your bellies were full and your hearts happy, there was evidence of good beyond your doing. Talking fast and hard like this, they prevented them from carrying out the sacrifice that would have honored them as gods, but just barely. Then some Jews from Antioch and Iconium caught up with them and turned the fickle crowd against them. They beat Paul, unconscious, and dragged him outside the town and left him for dead. But as the disciples gathered around him, he came to and got up. He went back into town and the next day left with Barnabas for Derbe. After proclaiming the message in Derbe and establishing a strong core of disciples, they retraced their steps to Lystra, then Iconium, and then Antioch, putting grit in the lives of the disciples and urging them to stick with what they had begun to believe and not quit, making it clear to them that it wouldn't be easy. Anyone signing up for the kingdom of God has to go through plenty of hard times, they said. Paul and Barnabas handpicked leaders in each church. After praying, their prayers intensified by fasting, they presented these new leaders to the Master whom they had entrusted their lives to. Working their way back through Pisidia, they came to Pamphylia and preached in Perga. And finally, they made it to Italia and caught a ship back to Antioch where it had all started, launched by God's grace and now safely home by God's grace. A good piece of work. On arrival, they got the church together and reported on their trip, telling in detail how God had used them to throw open the door of faith, wide open, so people of all nations could come streaming in. Then they settled down for a long, leisurely visit with the disciples.